This week, Trump announced a ceasefire with Iran that already appears fragile. But the most dangerous shift in this conflict is not the one being discussed in Washington briefings or argued across television studios in Tel Aviv. It is something quieter, far more calculated, something that, when it finally unfolds, will not resemble the wars we have known before. It will not start with explosions. It will start with silence. The silence of ports that stop operating, of highways that no longer link supply routes, of shattered runways unable to receive the cargo aircraft that keep militaries alive. And once that silence arrives, the most technologically advanced military force in the Middle East may have only days before it starts collapsing from within. Listen carefully to what I'm about to explain, because this is not political theater. This is mathematics. Behind closed doors, serious military analysts have been discussing something the political establishment on both sides of the Atlantic has been too distracted, too committed to outdated assumptions, or perhaps too afraid to address publicly. The issue is what Iran has truly been doing over the past several months beneath the spectacle of missile barges, intercepted drones, and dramatic satellite images dominating the news cycle. Because when you remove the theater and examine operational behavior through the cold logic of someone who understands how modern militaries actually work, not how they appear in press conferences or political speeches, but how they truly function, what they consume, what sustains them, where their real vulnerabilities exist, a picture begins to emerge that is not merely alarming. For those willing to look clearly, it is deeply revealing. Modern armies do not operate on courage alone. That belongs in memorials and patriotic speeches. Modern armies run on logistics, on fuel counted in hundreds of thousands of liters per brigade every day, on ammunition burned through by the thousands of rounds in only hours of sustained combat, on food, water, spare parts, and medical supplies moving constantly through an invisible network of ports, depots, roads, and rail systems, without which even the most advanced weapons on Earth become, within days, expensive pieces of useless metal. The Roman legions understood this. Napoleon learned it disastrously on the march to Moscow. The Wehrmacht discovered it in the Russian steppes. And now, in the ancient contested land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, we are watching an adversary that has studied this lesson with extraordinary patience and precision begin preparing to apply it. An advisor to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps stated publicly that Iranian facilities are so vast they have not yet revealed most of their capabilities, and that Iran possesses enough strike power to hit Israel every single day for 2 full years without exhausting its arsenal. Read that carefully. Not for weeks, not for months, 2 years of continuous daily strikes. Yet the discussion across Western capitals remains obsessively focused on interception rates and Iron Dome statistics, as though the real strategic issue is simply whether individual missiles are stopped. It is not. The real question is this: what happens when Iran stops targeting military bases directly and instead begins striking the infrastructure that allows those bases to function in the first place? Early data from the opening weeks of the 2026 conflict showed Iran's missile attacks against Israel continuing across multiple consecutive days. Even while Israel carried out non-stop airstrikes on Iranian launch facilities, Tehran absorbed the pressure and continued operating. It did not break. It tested, measured, and analyzed Israeli response times, identified weaknesses in defensive coverage, and cataloged which targets triggered which reactions. Every missile volley served not only as a weapon, but also as an intelligence-gathering operation. The patience embedded in that behavior is not the conduct of a regime acting out of desperation. It is the behavior of a state that believes both time and target selection favor its position. Israel relies on 3 major ports for incoming military supplies: Haifa in the north, Ashdod along the central Mediterranean coast, and Eilat on the Red Sea. Together, these facilities form the critical arteries of Israel's military sustainment network. They are not simply important from a logistical standpoint. They are essential for survival. Without operational ports, Israel cannot receive bulk ammunition shipments, heavy military hardware, aviation fuel, or the massive tonnage of supplies required to sustain prolonged combat operations. And the question Iran has been quietly exploring through its probing strikes over recent months is not whether those ports can be hit. The question is whether the specific infrastructure needed to unload cargo, the cranes, fuel pipelines, rail connections, and bonded staging areas, can be destroyed with enough precision and in sufficient quantity to make maritime resupply impossible, no matter how many ships Washington sends into the region. This is not speculation. It is pattern recognition drawn directly from observable Iranian operational behavior. The issue is no longer whether Tehran possesses this capability. Based on all available evidence, it almost certainly does. The real question, and the one that should keep serious strategists awake at night, is under what circumstances Iran would choose to use it. If this kind of direct and serious geopolitical analysis is why you are here, if you believe the world deserves more than comforting illusions disguised as expert commentary, then subscribe now, because what comes next is the part Washington would rather you never fully understand. As Trump described the ceasefire as being on life support, and Iran's parliamentary speaker warned that the Islamic Republic's military stands ready to teach any aggressor a lesson, sophisticated observers notice something the modern news cycle is structurally incapable of understanding. The rhetoric does not matter. Rhetoric is simply the noise powerful states produce to manage domestic audiences and project resolve abroad. What matters is the geometry of the targeting, the precise, systematic, deliberate pattern of what Iran has chosen to strike, and more importantly, what it has deliberately avoided striking. Because within that restraint lies the most important military message Tehran is sending, and much of the Western strategic establishment is failing to interpret it correctly. Consider the arithmetic of military logistics at the operational level, because this is where abstract strategic theory collides with the irreversible physical reality faced by armies in the field. An Israeli armored brigade conducting active combat operations does not consume fuel like ordinary civilian traffic. It burns roughly 180,000 liters every day. Once tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, engineering equipment, and the logistics convoy supporting the brigade are included. Multiply that figure across the number of armored formations currently deployed by Israel, and the daily fuel requirement climbs into the millions of liters. Israeli frontline units maintain fuel reserves sufficient for perhaps 3 to 5 days of combat operations. That reserve exists to absorb short-term disruptions in logistics. It is absolutely not designed to sustain a military campaign after the logistics network itself has been severed at the source. Artillery follows the same brutal mathematics. A single artillery battalion operating at sustained firing rates can expend hundreds of shells in one day. Across all deployed artillery systems, daily ammunition consumption during active combat reaches into the thousands of rounds. Add tank ammunition, anti-tank guided missiles, mortar shells, and precision-guided munitions for aircraft, and the scale of total daily consumption becomes almost difficult to comprehend. The forward ammunition depots holding these stockpiles exist for one purpose: to keep operations running while supplies continue flowing from the rear. But if that flow stops, if the depots themselves come under attack, if the storage magazines are burning and transport trucks cannot move because bridges have been destroyed, then whatever supplies an Israeli unit possesses at the exact moment of interdiction become precisely all it will ever have. And once those supplies are consumed, they are gone. Now understand what Iran's targeting doctrine would actually mean if it fully shifts toward logistics infrastructure. Phase 1 would not focus on dramatically sinking ships at sea. Instead, it would target the exact mechanical and civilian infrastructure needed to move cargo from ship to shore inside Israel's ports. Container cranes, fuel unloading systems, rail links, bonded warehouses. Destroy those systems, and the ships waiting offshore become meaningless because their cargo can no longer be accessed. Phase 2 would avoid wasting munitions on individual vehicles traveling across the country. It would strike the infrastructure those vehicles depend on. Military transport cannot simply bypass critical bridge crossings along primary logistics corridors, rail bridges, highway overpasses, and tunnels that serve as unavoidable choke points. Destroy a bridge, and you do not merely stop the vehicles currently crossing it. You stop every vehicle that requires that route until reconstruction becomes possible. And in a country the size of Israel, with only a limited number of major north-south and east-west transport corridors, destroying multiple bridges simultaneously does not create congestion. It creates strangulation. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz after the February 2026 US-Israeli strikes, it demonstrated precisely this principle of infrastructure warfare, not attacking armies directly, but severing the arteries that sustain them. The closure of the strait served as a proof of concept on the macro level. Applied internally against Israel's logistics network, the same strategy becomes a tightening vice rather than a blockade, constricting gradually and almost invisibly until the force relying on that system can no longer sustain itself in the field. Phase 3 is the most unsettling part of the analysis because it directly challenges the comforting assumption that classified information automatically guarantees security. Israel maintains a dispersed network of hardened forward logistics depots containing pre-positioned ammunition, fuel, and supplies intended to sustain military operations if rear area logistics come under pressure. The locations of these sites are among the most closely guarded secrets in Israeli military planning. And yet, over recent months, Iranian strikes have repeatedly hit facilities whose military functions were never publicly acknowledged. Satellite imagery later revealed ammunition storage bunkers, fuel tank farms, and pre-positioned military equipment at those sites. That level of targeting intelligence does not emerge accidentally. It reflects years of systematic battlefield preparation through human intelligence, signals intelligence, and commercial satellite analysis carried out with a level of patience and precision Western assessments have repeatedly underestimated. Then comes the fallback option American planners instinctively reach for whenever logistics vulnerability becomes obvious: emergency strategic airlift. The United States possesses immense heavy airlift capability. C-17 Globemasters and C-5 Galaxies are capable of transporting enormous quantities of cargo across continents. But strategic airlift still depends on functioning airfields with runways long enough and structurally intact enough to receive heavy aircraft. During the 2026 conflict, Iranian strikes shut down Israeli airspace for several days, disrupting operations at Ben Gurion and multiple other airports across the country. Iranian planners understand perfectly well that disabling runways does not require destroying entire airports. It only requires creating craters deep enough and numerous enough across runway surfaces to make heavy aircraft landings impossible. The strategic reality now emerging from the Iran-Israel confrontation is no longer centered purely on missile totals, interception rates, air defense systems, or political rhetoric. What is taking shape is a far more consequential form of warfare: the deliberate targeting of logistics infrastructure. And if this analysis proves accurate, then the true battlefield of any future regional conflict will not primarily be the skies above Tehran or Tel Aviv. It will be the ports, rail corridors, airfields, fuel depots, and transportation arteries that continue sustaining military operations long after the opening missile exchanges disappear from the headlines. The core issue is brutally straightforward. Modern militaries do not survive on courage, advanced technology, or political speeches alone. They survive through uninterrupted flows of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, communications equipment, and transportation capacity. Once those flows are disrupted at scale, military power begins decaying with remarkable speed regardless of how formidable that army may appear on paper. This is the vulnerability Iran appears increasingly determined to exploit. Under this evolving doctrine, the objective is not necessarily the outright destruction of Israel through direct battlefield confrontation. The objective is to steadily degrade Israel's capacity to sustain prolonged military operations by systematically targeting the infrastructure that allows the state to function during wartime. Ports such as Haifa and Ashdod, strategic air bases including Ben Gurion and Ramon, fuel distribution hubs, transportation junctions, railway links, and logistics depots become priority targets not because they carry symbolic value, but because they are operationally decisive. That changes the entire strategic equation. A Patriot battery, or any advanced air defense platform, possesses only a finite number of interceptors. Even highly sophisticated systems can eventually be overwhelmed when faced with large-scale saturation attacks involving hundreds of drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic projectiles arriving simultaneously from multiple directions. The purpose of saturation warfare is not necessarily to ensure that every missile reaches its target. The objective is to force the defender to expend interceptors faster than they can be replaced, creating temporary windows of vulnerability for follow-up strike waves. In such a scenario, the first wave may consist mostly of expendable drones designed to overload radar coverage and missile defense systems. The second wave targets the air defense infrastructure itself. The third wave then strikes the critical logistics nodes sustaining military operations. Once those nodes are damaged, the consequences spread rapidly throughout the entire system. A damaged runway delays strategic airlift operations. A destroyed fuel depot slows armored deployments. A disabled port crane interrupts ammunition deliveries. A severed rail connection delays nationwide distribution. Individually, each disruption may appear manageable. Collectively, they can become catastrophic. And this is where geography becomes destiny. Israel is an exceptionally capable military power, but it is also a geographically compact state with heavily concentrated infrastructure. Its strategic depth is limited. Major ports, transportation corridors, air bases, and fuel facilities are compressed into a relatively narrow geographic area. That concentration creates enormous efficiency during peacetime, but in war, it also creates vulnerability. A sustained precision strike campaign against critical infrastructure does not require complete destruction to achieve operational success. It only requires enough disruption to push the system below the threshold necessary for sustained military operations. This is a critical distinction frequently overlooked in public discussions about modern warfare. Interception percentages alone do not determine strategic outcomes. No air defense system achieves perfect interception. Even a relatively small percentage of successful strikes can produce enormous consequences when the targets are specialized infrastructure nodes with long repair timelines. A missile striking a civilian structure may be tragic, but from a strategic perspective, its impact can remain limited. A missile striking a fuel transfer terminal, a port loading crane, or a hardened communications hub can trigger cascading operational consequences lasting for weeks or even months. Repairing this kind of infrastructure is nothing like fixing roads after storms or rebuilding damaged structures. Specialized industrial equipment often requires manufacturing timelines measured not in days but in months or years. Heavy port cranes cannot simply be ordered overnight. Reconstructing runways during wartime conditions becomes extraordinarily difficult, especially if intermittent strikes continue during repair operations. Rail bridges, petroleum storage facilities, and electrical substations require engineering resources that become increasingly strained under sustained attack. This is where the limits of emergency resupply become impossible to ignore. The United States possesses enormous strategic airlift capacity, but airlift alone cannot fully sustain the logistical demands of a large-scale regional war if major ports and airfields are degraded. A single container ship can transport cargo volumes equal to dozens of C-17 sorties. If maritime infrastructure becomes unusable while runways remain under repeated precision attack, the mathematics of wartime logistics begin turning against even the most powerful alliances. And this is not merely a theoretical concern. Modern warfare repeatedly demonstrates that logistics determines endurance. Armies can continue fighting intensely for short periods despite disruptions in supply. Sustaining those operations for weeks or months is an entirely different challenge. Mechanized warfare consumes staggering amounts of fuel. Missile defense systems require continuous replenishment. Aircraft maintenance depends on uninterrupted spare parts chains. Precision-guided munitions stockpiles can deplete rapidly under high-intensity combat conditions. Yet despite the seriousness of these vulnerabilities, deterrence is still not the same as inevitability. Iran has not launched the kind of full-scale logistics interdiction campaign described in this analysis. Possessing the capability does not automatically mean the political decision to use it has been made. Diplomatic channels remain active. Ceasefire negotiations, indirect mediation efforts, and back-channel communications continue despite repeated breakdowns and escalating rhetoric. Multiple regional and international actors clearly understand the dangers posed by uncontrolled escalation. However, history repeatedly shows that capabilities developed over many years rarely remain permanently unused if leaders eventually decide strategic conditions justify deployment. Intelligence preparation, missile stockpiling, drone manufacturing, and targeting analysis represent long-term investments. Once those systems exist, they remain available during moments of crisis. That is why the current moment feels increasingly dangerous. The rhetoric surrounding Iran's nuclear program continues hardening. Washington has signaled growing impatience. Tehran continues resisting limitations it considers strategically unacceptable. Israeli security concerns continue intensifying as regional proxy networks expand and missile arsenals become increasingly sophisticated. In an environment like this, the greatest danger may not be deliberate war planning at all. The greatest danger may be catastrophic miscalculation. Wars often begin not because leaders irrationally desire destruction, but because each side incorrectly judges what the other side is willing to tolerate. Escalation becomes gradual. One strike produces retaliation. Retaliation invites counter-retaliation. Political leaders become trapped by domestic pressure, alliance obligations, military momentum, and fears of appearing weak. The result is that actions originally intended as limited signaling can spiral into systemic conflict far beyond what any participant initially intended. And the uncomfortable reality is that once such an escalation cycle fully begins, there may be no clean military solution available for any side involved. More interceptors alone cannot permanently solve a logistics vulnerability. More threats alone cannot force strategic surrender from an adversary willing to absorb extraordinary costs. More diplomatic statements alone cannot erase years of military preparation and mutual distrust. The challenge confronting regional powers is therefore not simply military. It is structural. It involves the entire architecture of modern warfare: supply chains, infrastructure resilience, strategic depth, industrial repair capability, economic endurance, and resource sustainability. What governments owe their populations during moments like this is not simplistic reassurance or theatrical confidence. They owe honest assessments of risk. They owe transparent recognition that even the most advanced military systems remain dependent on fragile logistical ecosystems. And they owe serious discussion about how future wars are actually fought, not through cinematic abstractions, but through the harsh material realities of fuel flows, shipping capacity, transportation networks, industrial repair capability, and resource exhaustion. Because if a major regional conflict eventually erupts, the greatest shock may not be the destruction itself. The greatest shock may be how visible the warning signs were long before the first decisive strike ever landed.